I always wondered, how could the federal government captivate the media? How could that, Bernstein or Woodward was a naval intelligence officer with no journalistic background. And the next thing you know, he's on the Metro desk at the Washington Post and is assigned the biggest story of our lifetime, that being Watergate. And so after Elon Musk bought Twitter, we learned that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, actually paid Twitter, as Mike Taibbi discovered, $3.4 million in exchange for them censoring and canceling people who wrote anything negative about the government narrative on COVID and the vaccine. Now, I'm beginning to sound to myself like some kind of mad conspiratorialist. But how much evidence do we have to have before we conclude that something very wrong is occurring in our federal government? And then one of the members of the Cox family, it's sort of a little bit off his rocker perhaps, but he was excommunicated from the family and they paid him $400 million for his minority interest in the company. And so he sat for a Vanity Fair interview, which was 30 pages long. I read it. And in that interview, he said that Cox Enterprises, a media and automobile company, have contracts with the Department of Defense. Really? Now, what kind of contracts would a media company have with the Department of Defense? Just leading me to my suspicion that they're all paid off, that they're all part of the game, and that somebody's got control. And my belief is, with evidence, that it is the CIA. I've read that they have their people planted, embedded in every department of the federal government and in most major media companies in America. And I am worried beyond words about the way that they are destroying this country. Now, I say that, and I feel such a huge surge of guilt when I say it, because I know that there are legions of people in the CIA who are patriots, who uphold the oath of office that they took. So I'm not painting a broad brush. But even going back to the Church Commission, we know that there are major abuses within the Intelligence Committee. We got the information and did absolutely nothing with it. Can you help rehabilitate me and give me some hope? How are we going to solve this problem? Or am I just off my rocker? Have I read too many books?
Well, there's no question we need to clean out a lot of the federal agencies. The federal government has grown so much over the last year. It's just as Reagan said, it's the only thing that never stops growing. The extended life on Earth is the federal government. If Trump gets elected, I think he's going to appoint Musk to go in and clean it do a root canal job on the federal government, which is very, very important.
Well, and Bobby Kennedy, too. And I said a year ago on this program that what a great team Trump and Bobby Kennedy would make if they could figure out a way to park their egos and come together to work for the good of the country.
Very, very difficult. Reagan tried it. We tried it. I mean, I do write about in the book in the first chapters right after the inauguration, in our first cabinet meetings. That was days after he was inaugurated. We had cabinet meetings where he tried to tell his cabinet officers that they had to clean out the bureaucracy, and he was promoting them to fire people and reduce their agencies and get out waste and to control their budgets and everything else. And as hard as he tried, and he was so excited about getting it done, he was thwarted by a lot of it by his own staff, who told him, you can't do this, you can't do that. And then, of course, and a lot of it was not just the federal bureaucracy, which is entrenched. It was the Congress itself. And the problem with Congress is those fellows and women go in there and they get elected year after year after year after year after year, and they want to stay in office. So they perpetuate themselves, and then they perpetuate the government that is around them, that they can give money to, that helps them send money back to their constituents to keep them in office. It's just terrible.
So it's just an unholy alliance where this federal government just becomes a monster, really, that you can't control. And again, I know there are millions of people that work for the federal government, hundreds of thousands that are good people, that are dedicated and motivated for the right reasons. And it works pretty darn good where it works. You know, they keep us safe. Air travel today is the safest place on earth, and the food that we eat and the water we drink, and our national defense is phenomenal. But there is a cancer in our federal government that has to be eradicated. Harry Truman started the CIA. He got it created. He went to Kennedy and said, "You've got to rein it in." Eisenhower said it had gotten out of control. Kennedy said that I'm going to split the CIA into a million pieces and spread the parts from the Pacific to Atlantic. 6 months later, he was dead. And you're saying that, I don't know specifically that Reagan was targeting the CIA so much, but Donald Trump was about to release the Kennedy files, and Mike Pompeo, like you were saying that Reagan's people did, talked him out of it. So that's where I think that Donald Trump should become a threat. I think Trump should be a threat to the bureaucracy. And that's what needs to happen in order to get our government under control. But let's talk about Reagan. You served him well, and you became actually closer to Reagan during his presidency, at least, than you were when you were in the Nixon White House, right?
Right. Yes, I became very, very close to Nixon after he was resigned, but then with Reagan, we bonded very closely, largely because I traveled with him in his 1980 campaign as his chief speechwriter, and then you become very close to a candidate when there's only very few of you working together in a campaign, and you're working day and night, trying to get elected. And I came up with his line there. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
You authored that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you should get royalties. And Trump should pay you because he just used your line in the debate with Harris a month ago.
Well, I'll send him a note. I'll get legal counsel to send him a note.
I think you should.
Well, plus on Make America Great Again, Reagan deserves royalties on that. That was his line. Anyway.
That was taken straight from Ronald Reagan?
Oh yeah, from his 80 convention speech. Yeah. That's not Trump's line, it's Reagan's line.
I'll be darned. I did not know that.
He first used it in his 80 convention speech. Then I put it back in his 84 convention and speech and his 88 convention speech. So Reagan used it 3 times in his convention speeches.
That's really good to know. All right, so who came up with the idea of telling Jimmy Carter, "There you go again"?
Well, that was Ronald Reagan. That's right. That was just as spontaneous right off the top of his head.
So tell us about Reagan. Could he get elected president today?
Sure. Oh yeah, in an instant. Yeah. If we got on this campaign trail, we could bury Kamala Harris easily. I'd love to be on a campaign with Reagan. Nixon could bury Kamala Harris.
Well, I think that Nixon had the persona of being a real fighter. Reagan just seemed to be everybody's best friend and somebody that you'd really like to be friends with. But I saw moments where he was tough, but was he tough behind closed doors?
Well, he could throw a punch when he needed to. And this is the whole notion about Reagan was, he was very genial and friendly and could tell a joke and lighthearted. But then back in '84, when Mondale was saying mean things about him in October in the campaign and was actually saying vicious things about him that was very untrue and very mean, and Reagan got under Reagan's skin, and he said to me, he says, "Look, we got a counterpunch," and Mrs. Reagan got very upset about it too, by the way, and said, "We're not going to take." Yeah, we're not going to take this anymore. And so Reagan said, let's go after, basically, we're going to go after Mondale. And that's when he assigned me to write a very tough speech. And there's some dates I remember very well. It was October 12th, and we did a whistle-stop campaign through southern Ohio, and where Reagan was pounding Mondale pretty good. So when he had to, Reagan could throw a punch.
But, I had a lunch with Donald Reagan many years ago, and I had just a great conversation with him. He was a very affable and enjoyable person to sit and have lunch with. even though there's no doubt in my mind that he was one tough cookie. But he said that to me, we were talking, I don't know how it came up. He said, well, Reagan never once gave him an instruction or an order as Secretary of the Treasury. And Reagan was with Reagan in the Oval one day and said, Mr. President, I've served you for 4 years, 5 years. And he said, I was Secretary of the Treasury. Never once did you pick up the phone and call me and tell me what to do. And he said Reagan's response was, well, Don, I just figured you knew how to run the Treasury better than I did. That sounds like Reagan to me from what I have read and studied.
In the case of Don Regan, Reagan agreed with him on supply side economics, and he agreed with him on the tax cuts. If you look at Reagan's diary, and of course that's reflected in my book, Don Regan, when he was at Treasury, agreed with Reagan on all his economic policy. And the disagreements came from the White House itself, from Jim Baker and Stockman and Dick Darman and David Gergen, and not from Don Regan. Don Regan was in Reagan's camp on economic, all the supply-siders were over at Treasury. Norm Torre and the others, Don Regan's staff, were all the supply-siders and tax cutters. And the problem was at the White House. So Reagan, unfortunately, didn't realize that the problems were right around the Oval Office, not over at Treasury. So that's why Reagan never heard from Reagan, was that Reagan had all the right ideas about economic policy during the Reagan administration.
So what would the counter have been by Baker and Stockman and others?
They believed from the outset, and again, I write about this in my book. I document it very carefully, which is why I want people to read my book, is that from the outset, Baker believed that the budget deficit was the much more critical problem than anything else, and that in order to get at the deficit, if you had to sacrifice tax cuts to do it, you needed to sacrifice the tax cuts. And he told me that right away. Baker told me that when I was working on the inaugural address. And he said, we have to sacrifice the Kemp-Roth tax cuts, we would need to do that. Well, that's not what Reagan believed. Reagan believed in the supply side thinking at the time, which is that if you cut taxes and generate enough prosperity, you're going to create enough wealth that you're going to create a lot of revenue, and the revenue is going to offset the budget deficit. So what you had was people having counter thinking right there within the White House. You had the president had disagreements with his own staff, and he told me that himself when I met with him in Camp David in June of 81, when he indicated to me his concerns that the fellas didn't want to reflect his crusade in the same manner as he did.
Well, would one of the fellas have been George Bush?
No.
Well, because he certainly he certainly ended up doing what the people you were talking about said to do. He said, no new taxes, read my lips. And then in his first term, he raised taxes, doing exactly what he promised not to do. I guess those people got to him. And how did that work out?
Well, that didn't work out well for Bush, but Bush was loyal to Reagan throughout his presidency, and Bush didn't try to influence him in any negative way, but it was Bush's people from his campaign, but not Bush himself.
Yes.
Bush, I give George Bush credit. He was loyal. He was a loyal vice president down the line.
So it seemed to me that Alexander Haig kind of got a short end of the straw in the Reagan administration. Would you agree with that? He had one slip of the tongue.
To some extent, he did. But he shot himself in the foot, and he sort of stormed in there. Al's a strong personality, having served as chief of staff, having been a 4-star general, having been Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, having held such high positions as he did. Now he came in as Secretary of State. I think he had a little bit of disdain for those in the White House. He didn't like being told what to do. And frankly, he thought probably he could be president. And And so it was sort of a two-way deal, and I think it was probably his strong personality got him in trouble a little bit. But on the other hand, they treated him with disdain, which they should not have. I think they should have had more respect for Al and his capabilities and his background and his knowledge and all the intelligence and intellectual capacity he brought to the office of Secretary of State. But they did not. And then, unfortunately, on the day of the assassination attempt, where I was with him when he ran up the stairs of the West Wing up to the press briefing room, and then he misspoke to the American public and said, I'm in control here, in a way that sounded sort of irrational.
Well, and to his in his defense, he said that he was not trying to give the impression that he was somehow sitting in the seat of the president of the United States, but that the vice president, I believe, was on an airplane on his way back to Washington. President President Reagan was at Bethesda. These were in the minutes right after the attempted assassination. And Alexander Haig said that he was just trying to reassure the American people and the other foreign leaders that there was stability in the White House. It seemed like an innocent enough mistake to me that it shouldn't have cost him his career. But I think the real problem was that he wasn't real chummy with Nancy Reagan, as I recall.
No, and he was being undercut to a great extent by those in the White House who didn't like his style, who didn't want Al challenging them, and so it was a clash of personalities, which happens with people in power, John.
Well, and I don't
I
think
wrote a whole chapter on that in my book about the power players in the White House.
well, I can't wait to read it. I don't think it's really limited to the White House. I mean, I've worked in corporate America. I've been in large corporations, and I remember my personal trainer told me that he lost a competition. I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Oh, John, I just don't know how to kiss ass. It was politics." So politics seems to inflict every aspect of our lives in one way or another. But in the moments remaining, you've been so patient, and I really have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Ken, and you've been so generous with your time. But I do want to ask you before we leave, roll it forward. Here we are in 2024. We've got less than 30 days before the election. Do you want to make book and tell us what your snapshot of, assessment is of this year's presidential race?
Going forward, I think Kamala Harris's campaign is just going to unwrap. I think it's going to fall apart. I woke up this morning and I was glued a little bit for 5 or 10 minutes to her Howard Stern interview on YouTube, and it was so monumentally stupid with the back and forth, how juvenile it was.
I watched it. I share your assessment.
I couldn't watch the whole thing. An hour of it would have been such a waste of time, but I watched enough of it, of her talking about them back and forth about how she loved Prince as her favorite artist, and that she and her husband, when Prince died, they danced and sang all night. And oh my gosh, it was
Well, it's just crazy. You
it was
know,
an unbelievable. It was so juvenile, and I think she's just going to fall apart like she did in the primaries, in the campaign between now and November. Then I think this could be a 6 to 7, 8% margin race, and not be a massive landslide, but be a comfortable electoral victory, and be a good margin for him to take into office, because I think her support collapses at the end.
so are we better off today than we were 4 years ago?
Biden, the message is that he has made us a culturally divided country. The Biden administration has destroyed the economy and have moved it so far towards government control on so many areas. So it's the people on the East Coast live in, I don't, no offense to you, John, but when I say East Coast, I mean what it's called, we used to refer to as Boss Wash, that corridor from Boston down to Washington. It's so enamored of itself that they don't think outside of where they are. And so I refer to the political newsletters that I read, and political analysts who think in terms of the pollsters and they're not getting the big picture, and the big picture is that the people aren't buying into that the billionaires and greed and all that stuff. That's not picking up on people. People don't live next to billionaires. People are living real lives.
Well, when I answer that question, I ask by what measure, and I would say in the most major issues in most people's mind are the economy, foreign policy, and public safety today. That means basically the border, I think, on the third tentacle. There's no rational person alive today who has any knowledge of the current conditions in the United States that could give the Biden administration good mark. It's a failing grade on every single one of those. Yet Kamala Harris repeatedly says, I was in the room for every major decision and agreed with President Biden. If you want 4 more years of this, then go vote for her. But she says she was Indian in 2020. She's today black, and I don't know if you've seen the information that Candace Owens is presenting, but there is significant evidence that her whole life story is basically one big lie. She has a picture of her with supposedly her black grandmother, and the lady she identifies as her black grandmother died 4 years before Candace Owens came onto the earth. So it's really hard to see her in a picture with her grandmother when Kamala Harris was in her teens. So just the whole approach seems to be one lie after another. The Tim Walz, 30 visits to China. And he said he fought in Iraq. That's called stolen valor because he didn't. And then he said that he was in Tiananmen Square when the citizens' revolt took place. My God, what is the matter with these people? And could you ever imagine under any circumstances ever allowing them to be in charge of the nuclear codes? I can't. It's a scary, scary time.
No, it's going to come down to that, and that's why it's going to unravel. Her campaign's going to unravel. But again, I think the former president needs to be disciplined and not feel so self-confident that he can say or do anything, because the people will want to feel confident that when he takes charge that he's committed to a stable government when he takes charge.
Ken, where can we find you if someone wants to get to know you better? And
Go to my website. Everything's on my website, www.reaganandnixon.com. It's easy to find, www.reaganandnixon.com. You can communicate with me. You can find my book. You can find links to a lot of my other interviews. And I hope they'll get my book. It's got all this information in it. It's got all the information about it's a roadmap to Republican victory, about cleaning out the government, about power players, about what happened in the Nixon and Reagan years. And anyway, I hope you'll go to it. It's reaganandnixon.com, no ampersands.
I absolutely will. I'm going to order the book. It's entitled Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. What a lifetime experience that must have been. And I appreciate your coming on and sharing all this wealth of knowledge with our listeners and our viewers today. Ken Khachigian, an historian, a political activist, and a very enjoyable person to talk to. Thank you so much. Have a great day.